It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, I'm going to need you to hang on for a bit before we get into the real meat of this week's movie. I will say that this flick is an ultra-obscure indie movie from Scottish director Lowry Brewster, The Devil's Machine. However, before I can really get into it, I kind of need to set the scene of how I even saw this movie. Now, I'm someone who really likes to go to conventions. Before the start of the 21st century, I didn't go to too many, but there were a few that I did go to that were really cool. In the late 80s, Indianapolis became the home of a decently sized Star Trek convention called Starbase Indy. That happened, eventually it happened annually on Thanksgiving weekend. I remember going to the very first one that started here in March of 1988 out by the old Indianapolis International Airport. However, after that's when Starbase Indy started happening every Thanksgiving weekend and drew some pretty significant guests. These days, that show has shifted its focus to more of a convention that kind of centers itself on STEM and humanitarianism that was inspired by Star Trek. The other fun event that I would go to was what was known as the Ash Comics Show, that would more or less be a swap meet and less a typical convention. You go there and look to maybe sell something or trade something, but mostly you're looking to see what others had for sale to complete your collection. The Ash shows ran at least until 2019, when they seemingly came to an end, and I can kind of understand why. Those shows were larger before other local conventions came along. Now that we have Indiana Comic Con and Indy Pop Con and some of the other smaller shows in smaller towns. But I remember going there and seeing all sorts of cool stuff, from back issues to bootleg videotapes of concerts and what have you. It was always a fun couple of hours on a Sunday to go and check stuff out. In 2001, I started going to a far larger convention in Chicago put on by Wizard magazine. Wizard was the comics magazine, as they called themselves, and they ran a few Wizard World shows around the country in the early aughts. In particular, their crown jewel was their Chicago Wizard World. I started going to those in the midst of their explosion as a pop culture event, and I even went to two of the early C2E2 shows in Chicago with press passes when I used to write for a now defunct comic book website. Now, the fun and excitement around going to those shows quickly expanded into checking out other events here in Indy. In 2014, both Indiana Comic Con and Indy Pop Con started, and Indiana Comic Con is a never miss show for me. Well, when there isn't a pandemic, I should say. But PopCon has its own energy that is fun to just kind of take in for a couple of days. And I suspect I'll be attending more PopCons much more often, as the gang here at Film Seizure plan to attend more shows and do more live events there. While neither Indiana Comic Con nor PopCon can really compare to some of those early Wizard Worlds I used to go to, they are still a lot of fun and things that I do look forward to. However, there's another show that I get excited about each year now, Horror Hound. Now, Horror Hound is a magazine about horror movies who started doing their own conventions in Cincinnati and Indianapolis every 6 months. And I started going to the Indianapolis version, I think it was in 2013, and I've been to most that have been here since. Then, in 2019, myself and a trio of friends decided to try out the Cincinnati show in March of that year and see how that compared to the ones here, especially since it sometimes seems that the Indianapolis version attempts to be a little bit bigger with the inclusion of other smaller conventions partnering with Horror Hound, like Mask Fest and a cryptozoology show that was part of the September 2019 Indie show. Anyway, I wanted to start with that giant preamble because one of the great things about all those shows I've gone to, there are usually something in each one of those years and each one of those shows I went to that becomes incredibly memorable. That's the great thing about conventions. If you're about that sort of stuff, you know what I'm talking about. Not all memories are warm and fuzzy, but there's something unforgettable about each one. And that's where the Devil's Machine finally comes into play. In Cincinnati, at that Horror Hound 2019 show, I knew of the film festival that was usually highly promoted and talked about at that Cincy Horror Hound. On the first day, Friday night, one of our group was scheduled to get a tattoo done by one of her favorite artists that I think she first noticed at a previous Horror Hound in Indy, but I digress. So while she was going to be doing that for a few hours, it gave the other three of us a chance to not only get a look around at the show itself, but we checked out the program and spotted this movie in the program in the film festival section called Automata. And it was from Scotland, and it sounded like something that might be kind of a creepy movie with a clockwork-style automation and automaton that might be haunted or might be a killer or who knows. It caught our attention, and we decided to go check it out. Now, I was happy that I did. This movie is a slow burn horror movie, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue this episode. But once I saw it, I needed to find out more about how I could see it again or get a copy of it. Hex Studios, which director Lowry Brewster runs, was not at the show, and I didn't quite expect them to be, considering they are a Scottish company, and it was highly unlikely that they were going to be at a show in the U.S. Midwest when their movie played on the first night at the first time slot. But anyway, I was hoping to find out something more about it. Well, I did ultimately find it later, but it was under a different name. You see, there was a movie from 2014 that was a Spanish-Bulgarian co-production starring Antonio Banderas that was also called Automata. So, Hex changed the name for home video and called it The Devil's Machine, which makes sense. Now, Lowry Brewster's been making movies one way or another since starting out in short films in 2010. In 2013, he made a movie called Lord of Tears that features a version of the UK folklore creature, the Owl Man. He followed that movie up with a couple of more movies featuring the creature, and I like how the Owl Man in these movies look a little like the killer in the Italian giallo movie Stage Fright. And we've covered that movie earlier this year on Film Seizure if you're curious to hear more about that one. Now, Brewster's worked pretty consistently since getting into film. The Devil's Machine has a couple of actors that he worked with in past movies. Jamie Scott Gordon, who is playing the guy studying the Clockwork Doll, Dr. Brendan Cole, and American actress Alexandra Holm, who plays the very doll itself. But let's dig into this efficient little thriller. The movie does open with a warning from writer-producer Sarah Daly that states that some scenes might make some viewers uncomfortable due to some of the themes of sexual abuse and misogyny and violence towards women. Now, I've seen this movie a few times and I know where it's coming from. In fact, I had to question myself if I actually wanted to do this episode in the long run, because there are some fairly disturbing things. And with how this show operates, I am going to be talking about some of that. So be mindful of that. And if you are interested in seeing the movie, like I said, I do spoil it. So you may want to try to track down a way to see this movie. If you are uncomfortable about some of the themes that I just mentioned, sexual abuse, misogyny, violence towards women, and I wouldn't blame you if you decided to kind of skip this one. So the movie begins with some soldiers from what appears to be the 18th century transporting a trunk. Now, whatever is in that trunk appears to be able to express some of its desires to others. First, it tries to get what I believe is a Prussian soldier to open it to, quote, let her out. Then a British soldier talks about how, quote, she wants, and that they should just let her have whatever it is that she wants. The brief battle ends with a British soldier and a Prussian soldier carrying the trunk off into the distance. In the present, a clockmaker and expert in antiquity Dr. Brendan Cole is called to a remote estate with his stepdaughter, Rose. And it's pretty clear that Rose's mother has died, but she still lives. And I don't know if Dr. Cole is like a guardian or if she's just living there. But they have a pretty close and very friendly relationship, despite him being her stepfather. Now, she is reading a book that Cole has written about what's called the Infernal Princess. And Rose is pretty fascinated by the story and even draws the princess on what appears almost to be like a throne. When they arrive at this estate, they are told a story about a clockwork doll made in the image of a brutal general's wife. And the general's doll seems to pass a curse along to anyone who becomes interested in it. This is why it's now called the Infernal Princess when it was originally called the Eternal Princess. Now, people become almost enthralled by it to the point that it resembles kind of falling in obsessive love with this clockwork doll. Whole families become inflicted with this love, and they begin to kind of kill themselves, each other and then themselves. The Infernal Princess over time went missing, but has recently resurfaced. This man, Frederick, whose family had something to do with the creation of the Infernal Princess, is offering £1 million for Dr. Cole to stay 1 week and authenticate that it is indeed the same clockwork doll of legend. Rose, while he's being kind of offered this job in the other room, starts hearing strange music and is seemingly called to the doll. Cole is then shown the doll, but he refuses to believe that it's the real thing. But Cole will get his £1 million if he can get the doll to perform the 5 feats it was programmed to do. And it's something that this Frederick guy has yet to accomplish. The doll definitely appears to be almost like a real person. It looks like it has real skin, real hair, real everything. It's like it could get up and move at any moment, which it does from time to time in the movie. But most of the time, it just sits in the chair and stares directly ahead. Frederick has also included all sorts of ghastly reports and papers telling stories of the Infernal Princess and those who have been inflicted with these bad thoughts. All the stories seem to come with some sort of spooky tale of a woman who moves like clockwork. The next day, Rose and Cole get to work and to basically try to activate the first of the 5 programmed acts. Have the doll stick her hand out to be kissed when presented with a rose, and they succeed. However, what's more is that Brendan seems to be transported to the unveiling ceremony back in the 18th century where a beautiful woman whispers in his ear. In addition, Rose seems to get noticed across time as well by the brutal general. Things start to get a little bizarre as Cole begins to see the doll apparently move in a mirror, but it didn't actually move in real life. Also, he's starting to see Rose seemingly stalk about in the dark house overnight. That same night, he's visited by a ghostly vision of the beautiful woman named Talia. And this is the woman who the Infernal Princess was modeled after. While Rose sleeps, another specter tries strangling her, and she sees a hand closing her bedroom door. Now here's where the real uncomfortable stuff starts to happen. Rose goes looking for whoever it was that was apparently in her room, and she approaches the doll and picks up the rose that's on the doll's lap. When Cole suddenly snaps at her that it doesn't belong to her, she seductively thanks her, quote, daddy. So yeah, the doll is awakening some passions and reawakening other terrible things. Cole watches Rose outside dancing a very specific dance, and then realizes that the next feat has been performed by the doll. She's written a romantic poem. The more time that passes, the more sexually charged everything becomes. Rose asks Brendan at one point if he'd like the doll to just flat out tell him to fuck her. Brendan's dreams of the woman who the doll is based on is much more explicit. When Rose is scared one night by a nightmare and by various sounds that she hears around the house, she wants to sleep with Brendan, and she kind of cuddles him in a way that she probably shouldn't. And what's more, a pale, deathly looking man, the brutal general himself, is beginning to stalk Rose. Things take a pretty disturbing turn when Brendan discovers some sexually explicit drawings that is inside Rose's sketchbook. She then basically puts Brendan's hands on her breast, trying to, get something out of him. He slaps her and she gets kind of turned on by it. She even calls him daddy again and thanks him for the slap. He wants to leave, but she apologizes for how she's been acting and begs for them to stay. If for nothing else, they are one day away and one last feat away from the £1 million. On their last night there, they have to have the doll perform what's called the Last Supper. They decide to turn it into a fancy dinner. They'll get dressed up in formal clothes and enjoy their last night as what Rose says, the Lord and Lady of the Manor. Before that, though, Brendan finds a confession from Alexander McIntosh, the man who actually built the Infernal Princess. Talia, the wife of the brutal general, and McIntosh were in love. However, the general, told that the automaton that he wanted to be built was impossible, suggested that they basically make believe that it works by placing Talia inside the doll and act out the various feats. The general would pretend that his wife ran away or went missing and that the creation itself was real. When their affair between Dollmaker and Talia is discovered, the general punishes Talia by cutting her tongue out, and he places her in the doll rather forcibly. Now, the general promises to give her back to McIntosh after the unveiling party, but the general has sealed her in, and she more or less dies inside the doll and becomes something kind of demonic and unearthly. She then trapped McIntosh inside a building and set it on fire and prevented every possible escape. And at this point in time, it seems almost as if she has basically, supposedly, burned down the very manor that Brendan and Rose are in, which makes the whole setting seem like maybe it's not really there. Now, shaken by this, Brendan tries to understand how she could have performed for him, but that's when the ghost of the general reveals himself and things start to become a little more clear. The general will basically possess or teach Brendan how to tame his stepdaughter, who is now more or less possessed by Talia. The Infernal Princess leads Brendan to the brink of having sex with Rose, and by the way, she's seemingly drugged and under the influence of both Talia and the general. But when Brendan gets his senses back, the general decides that he will take care of Rose himself, while Talia again seduces Brendan, making him want to whip her with his belt, but after doing so, he realizes that he's whipped Rose. The general says that he knows how to break Rose in and get her wild spirit under control and takes her away, but when Brendan chases him, he is soon haunted by others who were friends with the general, and all sorts of wild stuff and spirits kind of show up and create nightmare situations for both Brendan and Rose. It's more or less the final tortures that seem to typically send people over the edge to have them kill others and then themselves. In a lot of ways, it's a little bit like The Shining in this last scene. All the crazy stuff happens. But in order to save Rose from having the same fate that Talia suffered at the hands of the general by having her tongue cut out, Brendan promises himself to Talia forever. The next morning, Brendan and Rose prepare to leave, and he has her go outside and wait by the car for him. After several minutes of waiting for him, Rose tries to get into the house, but Brendan opens the door and tells her that she must leave and never return. He has to stay behind, and as he tells her to be happy in her life, the Infernal Princess is creeping up behind him. All right, so let's get to the three things that I like about The Devil's Machine. First and foremost, I like that this movie takes its time. It feels like the type of story that would be told over a few hundred pages of a book. It's about a mystery surrounding old legends of cruel men and cruel passion. It haunts everyone and everything. It's not about editing trickery like present-day horror movies would have. It certainly contains some very nice jump scares, particularly as they relate to nightmares, but it's the type of movie that spooks you through its story. And that's number two. The story really kind of draws you in. If you are hooked and curious about where this movie goes when you first see the Infernal Princess, that very first time, then you're really only going to get drawn in further. The movie twists and turns through dreams, hallucinations, nightmares, and reality and revelations almost effortlessly. It's hard to say for sure what is actually real and being experienced and what is manifesting from the supernatural stuff around this doll. In addition to that, we know that the general's a pretty awful guy, but you begin to think that maybe so is Talia, that she's almost infected by or haunted by the cruelty that the general imposes on her, to the point that it twists her into that becoming something of a fetish for her. You know, this is part ghost story, part spooky old tales about a weird old man who likes to treat things terribly, and part horror story of base desire. Both Brendan and Rose succumb to debauched decadence. If nothing else, it might actually be a relatively accurate portrayal how some powerful people treated their wives, mistresses, and daughters in the not distant enough past. Thirdly, the performances by the two women in this movie, Alexandra Holm as Talia and the Infernal Princess, and Victoria Lucy as Rose, they really do have to carry a ton of this movie in two different ways. First of all, I have to give all sorts of credit to Holm for having to spend so many shots and scenes completely and totally still. I'm always looking for a twitch in her eyes or a change in her half-cocked smile, but she's perfectly still. It's actually even more unnerving to see her unmoving like that. It's just the right uncanny that makes your skin kind of crawl. And yes, of course, she's very pretty. You kind of scoff at the idea of people becoming obsessed with what's not much more than an advanced mannequin. But yeah, she's impressively gorgeous as that unmoving thing that seems to watch you wherever you go, even if her eyes stay glued forward. As for Victoria Lucy, she's brilliant too as Rose. She has to wind her way around scenes, oftentimes changing her attitude and her demeanor multiple times in a single scene. At times she's sweet and innocent, and the dutiful stepdaughter of the man her mother loved. And other times she's bratty, and still other times she's sensual and very forward, with her not being quite the innocent girl we thought she was. Sometimes when an actor has to change their tone or their performance in a movie like this, it doesn't quite feel right. There's something that makes you think that you're actually seeing two completely different people being portrayed on screen. I believe it every time that this is the same Rose and she's giving different performances while still being the same person. It's hard to even see exactly who the real her is. Was she always attracted to her stepfather? Was she truly the innocent and dutiful surrogate daughter to a widower? Is she a sweet girl, or is she a grown woman with very mature appetites that are buried down deep inside her? Regardless of what she's playing to, I believe Victoria Lucy is accurately portraying Rose. Her swings and attitude don't feel out of place or jarring, and that's quite difficult for almost anyone to pull off. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. We'll also be returning with new episodes of Film Seizure in September. So don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as subscribing to us on YouTube, where we upload these episodes there as well. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Now, next time, I'm going to revisit a movie that nearly 40 years ago scared me so deeply I've never revisited it until now. So watch out, because something wicked this way comes. Until next week, stay spooky.